I'd like to present the history of medicine in Cape Breton for a 200-year period, 1784 to 1984. The first settlers to come to Cape Breton came in 1784 from England, and I'd like to tell you things about the first settlement, particularly the medical history of the settlement. Usually when I give a talk like this, I get questions from the audience. Who were the first medical practitioners, and in this case in Cape Breton? Where did they receive their medical and surgical training? What training did they receive? What diagnostic methods did they use? What infectious diseases were prevalent in Cape Breton at the time, 1784 and afterwards? How did medical practitioners treat disease and illness during the 200-year period? How was mental illness treated during the period? Who was responsible for establishing hospitals in Cape Breton over the last 200 years? The first doctor to come to Cape Breton, and he was with the original settlers who came to Cape Breton, came to Sydney in 1784. They arrived on the Blenheim, the ship Blenheim, in November 1784. You can imagine coming into Cape Breton in November, but they decided to come then. It must have been extremely difficult that winter for them because there was nobody in Sydney. They were creating Sydney, so nobody was there except the indigenous people, of course. Smith is very, very interesting, a very unusual character, and it's very surprising that he was with the first settlers. He had written many, many books before he came to Sydney. The title page of his first book, which was published in London in 1768, identified him as William Smith, M.D. Because of the name William Smith, Dr. William Smith, it's very, very difficult, and in fact it's been impossible to determine where he did get his M.D. It could have been at Oxford, but it could have been elsewhere. We've never been able to figure out where he came from. He had published 10 books prior to coming to Sydney. 6 of his books were on medical topics, and the remaining were on history, government, punishment, and prisons. In fact, he was a doctor in a prison for a while before he came to Sydney. He was the only physician and surgeon in Sydney from 1784 to 1791. In fact, the only surgeon in Cape Breton. He was appointed a member of the Council of Cape Breton in 1785. He returned to London in 1791 to arrange for payments of his debts. This gives an indication of why he probably was in Cape Breton. I think he probably escaped from London because he was so far in debt that they were going to put him in debtor's prison, which was a common thing to do at that time for people who had great debts. So he probably decided, rather than going to prison, he would, in fact, he worked in a prison, but he didn't really want to go into debtor's prison, so he came to Cape Breton as a surgeon to the garrison there. He returned to Cape Breton, and he was appointed Chief Justice of Cape Breton in 1798, which is an unusual thing to be done for a doctor to become Chief Justice, but he did become Chief Justice. He was quite an enthusiastic and charismatic sort of character, I expect. However, he ran into problems with the other leading citizens in Sydney, and he left Cape Breton in September of 1800, never to return. He probably went back to London, but I haven't been able to trace him after he returned, again because of this very common name of William Smith. Now, if you look at Sydney, the first map that was done of Sydney, it was done around 1786. A plan of the town of Sydney in island of Cape Breton. And if you remember, any time you've gone to Sydney, sort of the main street there is the Great George Street, which you can see in this plan. And you could see the Esplanade now, and the last time I was in Sydney, that was a beautiful walkway along the harbor. And I show this because I wanted to show that right at the beginning they decided to provide the citizens with a hospital. So during the 2 years from 1784 to 86, there was a lot of work being done in Sydney to produce streets and buildings and so on, including a hospital. The hospital is letter C, which, if you look at this diagram, is next to Charlotte Street, North Charlotte Street, and the Esplanade. You'll see the letter C there, small building, and that was the hospital. And that's where William Smith would have provided medical and surgical attention while he was there. Now, here's the cover page of his book that he wrote in 1768. Fortunately, there is a copy of this book in the Nova Scotia archives, and it's very interesting to read, a dissertation upon the nerves. It's really quite interesting to read because that's a very early period to have a book on trying to understand the function of nerves. As I said before, he was the first physician surgeon in Cape Breton, and really there was about a 20-year period when Cape Breton didn't have a doctor or a surgeon at all. And it wasn't until 1822 that we get the second surgeon to show up. That was John White. And so I made a list of the other doctors who came before Confederation, before 1867. And you'll notice an interesting thing about them is most of them, in fact, all of them did have actual training. There's usually a myth about physicians and surgeons who practiced during the early 19th century that they didn't have really much training. But in fact, it turns out, as you could see, that all of these individuals had training at Edinburgh or at Dublin or Glasgow, London, Marischal, which is in Scotland, or New York, Bellevue, or Harvard. So they were as well trained as anyone at that time. You'll also notice that two of them were licensed by the Nova Scotia government to practice medicine. Alexander Hare in 1829 and Samuel Peters in 1866. A lot of these physicians didn't stay very long in Cape Breton. I did highlight those on the right column who did stay a long time, and one person practiced there for 42 years. So they moved around a lot because it was very difficult to earn a living at that time because most of the citizens didn't have any money to pay. Two long-serving doctors in Sydney and Sydney Mines were Dr. Lewis Johnston in Sydney, graduated from Edinburgh, and Dr. Alexander McGilvray from Bellevue, which is a hospital in New York, which had a medical school. And a surgeon at Sydney Mines, Thomas Jeans, here's a photograph of him, born in Ireland, educated in Glasgow. He was licensed to practice medicine surgery in Nova Scotia in 1829, a surgeon to the Cape Breton Regiment. At that time, physicians usually had their own drugstore, and he had his drugstore in North Sydney. And one of his inventions was the vegetable antibilious pills for dyspepsia, stomach upset, and so on. That was very common at that time to sell pills for such things, and that's how they made some additional money. Now, a doctor up in the Inverness County, Dr. John Noble, he was at Port Hood. He was there for almost 30 years, born in Inverness, Scotland, attended St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, wrote at the College of Surgeons of London in 1820 and passed his exams, and then came out to Inverness, Cape Breton. He became the health officer at the Gut of Canso, became a surgeon of the Cape Breton Regiment, and he had a large family. One of his sons actually left Cape Breton and went out to Minnesota and became one of the legislators there, Honorable John E. Noble. I was able to make contact with descendants of Dr. John Noble and was able to acquire this photograph, which is quite a unique little photograph. I enjoy it. Now in Ayrshire, there was the Robin Company from the Guernsey Island between England and France. There's an island there called the island of Guernsey, and a Robin family from that island came out to Ayrshire and to Cheticamp and set up large industries acquiring fish and furs that they sent back to Europe. They also attracted doctors to come to Cape Breton, to Ayrshire, because, of course, they had a large number of employees, the Robin Company did. And the first doctor they attracted was Dr. Andrew Madden, who had studied at Glasgow. He looks pretty serious in this photograph. It's the only photograph I think we found of him, and he just doesn't appear to want to smile, but still, we do have a capture of his image. He was followed by Dr. Charles Fixit, and he had studied at Guy's Hospital. They spent many, many years in Ayrshire as the doctors, and I'm sure they treated the Acadians as well as treating, because there were mainly Acadians in that area, but there are also a lot of employees from England to the Robin Company. Now, when you think of medicine and surgery prior to the 1870s, it was somewhat crude. There were really two types of medicine practice. One was allopathic, and the other was alternative. The allopathic or depletive medicine involved approximately 4 different approaches. The whole idea was to try to remove the contents of the cavities in the body, that is the bowels, the stomach, the urinary bladder, and also to remove a certain amount of blood from the person. It was felt that if you could remove a large content of what was in those chambers, that you'd also remove the disease that was causing the problem. So we do have mercury being used as a cathartic. We have emetics used to induce vomiting. We have diuretics to empty the urinary bladder, and of course we have bloodletting, which was very, very common prior to 1870. They just didn't know what else to do. The other type of treatment were alternative therapies, that alternatives to allopathic. Allopathic, of course, means all diseases were treated the same. That's where the word comes from. The alternative therapies included Thomsonian, which is named after a Thomsonian doctor. He used lobelia. It was a plant that if you ate some of the plant, it would raise your temperature and you would sweat very, very profusely and get rid of the disease that way, or so he thought. Then there were all kinds of herbal remedies. There was hydropathic remedies, including immersing yourself in salt water. Salt Springs in Pictou County was a good example. People would go to Salt Springs in Pictou County and sort of immerse themselves in the water because there was a very large or high salt content in the water. Mesmerism or hypnotism was used to try to cure disease. Homeopathic methods, which are still, in fact, used by some people, and electrotherapy. Electrotherapy was typically used to try to innervate nerves and muscles by applying a small electric voltage to the muscle to get it to contract. The theory being that if you could get muscles to contract, they would require more blood to flow to that area, and more blood flow would move whatever the disease was towards the kidneys and then out of the body. So it was another method that's used, and of course it's still used to stimulate nerves and muscles in various parts of the body. At the same time as those were the treatment methods, we also had methods of diagnosis. Very few at the time, but they gradually improved over the 19th century. The first major one to come along was the stethoscope, which was invented in 1816 for listening to sounds emanating from the heart and from the lungs. Then in 1830, we have the achromatic microscope, which allowed you to see very, very, very small objects in blood or in urine or whatever. Then we have the ophthalmoscope to look at disorders of the eye in 1851. The clinical thermometer in 1869. The thermometer had been around a long time, but doctors didn't start using a thermometer in a clinical sense until 1869, a very, very small thermometer that was especially designed for putting in under the tongue or in the anus or whatever. Then in 1881, we start measuring blood pressure with the sphygmomanometer. 1895, we have the X-ray. These are major advances, the X-ray and the electrocardiogram in 1896. And then finally in 1901, we have blood grouping. Before that, it was not known that people actually had a different type of blood. And if you thought of blood transfusion, which actually wasn't being done, although it had been done a few times before and didn't necessarily have good results because they didn't know anything about blood grouping. So you can see that the diagnostic procedures were not that great, not very many of them, during the early part of the 19th century. The other thing that was lacking was a total understanding of what disease was. And so it's not until 1867 that Louis Pasteur comes up with germ theory and the notion that bacteria actually exist. Before that, people didn't really believe there was such a thing as bacteria. They couldn't see it, and they didn't have any idea what it was. So Pasteur and another person by the name of Joseph Lister, they came up with the idea that bacteria really did exist and was causing the infection of wounds and led to the transmission of disease as well between people. So during the period 1867 to 1877, a 10-year period, Louis Pasteur and his assertion of microorganisms that they exist and can infect surgical wounds, and Joseph Lister's antiseptic procedure for preventing microorganisms from creating suppuration and putrefaction in wounds were rejected by leading physicians, physiologists, surgeons, and medical practitioners all over England and France and the United States. It was a 10-year period, really a dark period in medicine, because they had come up with a theory and Lister had put it into practice and showed that if he used an antiseptic, the antiseptic being carbolic acid, during surgery and after surgery, that he could prevent infection in the patients that he had operated on. But it took a long time for them to convince other surgeons and medical practitioners that this was in fact the case. And it's because they could not see the bacteria. They didn't believe it existed. So once they convinced them to start using the microscope and taking a look at blood and urine, until they did that, they were not sure and didn't believe that there were microorganisms infecting the wound. By 1877, Lister and his student, Dr. John Stewart, of course, was a Nova Scotian and was there working with Lister, thank goodness. They went down to London and tried to convince the surgeons of the efficacy of antiseptic surgery. And eventually they did convince the London surgeons. London was the largest center of surgeons in all of England, and they eventually convinced them that antiseptic surgery was very, very important and should be used to reduce and eliminate infection. So it wasn't really until after that, another 10 years or so later, that various bacteria are identified. For instance, cholera bacteria in 1883, tuberculosis bacteria in 1882, diphtheria bacteria in 1883, streptococcus in 1880, trachoma 1886, typhoid 1880, whooping cough or pertussis in 1906. And these people who discovered these, you'll notice pretty well all in the 1880s. It was very, very, very busy in the scientific world in the early 1880s in France and Germany in particular. And Nobel Prizes were awarded for a number of these discoveries, very important discoveries, of course. Then we have other diseases like typhus fever and viral diseases such as measles and smallpox and yellow fever. They were finally discovered as to what was causing them as well. Back to Cape Breton, after 1870, when we get into the time of scientific medicine, Before 1870, we called it allopathic medicine. And after Confederation, or after 1870, we called it scientific medicine, where we're actually talking about, well, what is a disease and how do you deal with it? Dr. Dodd, who was a physician surgeon at Bridgeport, which is near Sydney, he was born there, educated at Mount Allison in Acadia, did his MD in New York, and he became a doctor at International Mines in Bridgeport. And he practiced for 58 years, which is quite remarkable. But he was a sort of a household name in Cape Breton for a long time. Dr. Arthur Kendall was in Sydney for many years. You can see 60 years. He was born there, attended Mount Allison, surgery training at Guy's Hospital, did his surgery degree in London in 1884. He was chairman of the Medical Relief Committee for the Halifax explosion. He came down to Halifax the morning of the explosion and immediately took on the role of chair of the committee. He later became a member of the legislature in Nova Scotia and a member of Parliament for Cape Breton. Now, in Bedeque, Cape Breton, there were two very highly revered doctors who practiced there for many, many years. One was Dr. John Bethune. His descendants have been very active in medicine over the years. Dr. Gordon Bethune was the chair of surgery here at Dalhousie at the VG, and his sons are both medical doctors in Halifax. Dr. McMillan, who's usually referred to as the Cape Breton doctor, he was in Bedeque, and he's the one that wrote the book on the Cape Breton doctor about his career treating patients in the vicinity of Bedeque. A very, very interesting book to read because he spent many, many nights in the dark trying to travel to see patients by traveling across the Bedore Lakes on ice cakes and this and that, and his wagon and horse went through the ice a few times, and he almost drowned a few times, but he did survive. Now, during the Halifax explosion, it's remarkable that the doctors and nurses in Sydney immediately reacted and got on the train the same day as the explosion and came to Halifax. There were 24 nurses and 14 doctors got on that train as soon as they heard about the Halifax explosion, and they came to Halifax, and then they were here for usually 6 or 8 days trying to treat and care for the injured. It was remarkable that they were able to react so fast and into a situation where they really didn't know what they were coming into. They just knew there was an explosion here, and they just decided to come. And their names are given in the newspaper, this article that appears in front. Now, when we come to hospitals established in Cape Breton, there were many, many hospitals established there. And I've put together a list of them. They're not only the typical hospital that we think of today, but also there were asylums, which were for the mental patients, and also for people who were poor, what we referred to as paupers. They usually were housed in the same building. So the first one that was actually established in Cape Breton was in Inverness County, and it was the Inverness County Asylum and Poorhouse, 1888. And in Sydney, they established the Cape Breton Asylum. The word asylum has been used down through history for those people who require care because they can't care for themselves. And it's usually sort of related to people with mental illness. And the first hospital then, General Hospital, was established was St. Joseph's Hospital in Glace Bay, and it was established by the Steel Company of Canada for their members, really, but eventually was available to anyone in Glace Bay. And then Sydney established the hospital, the Brookland Hospital, the next year. Sydney Mines in 1908, North Sydney in 1908, New Waterford in 13, Glace Bay General Hospital in 1914. Turned out the St. Joseph's Hospital was a Roman Catholic hospital, so that the Protestants felt they wanted their own hospital, so they created the Glace Bay Hospital in 1914. Sydney City Hospital in 1916. The Brookland Hospital in Sydney burned down, so they built the Sydney City Hospital. Then we had the Ross Memorial Hospital in 1920, and Inverness had two hospitals, one for Roman Catholics and one for Protestants in the 1920s. Here's St. Joseph's Hospital, and it's really quite a large structure, as you can see. It was established by the Dominion Coal Company and operated by the Sisters of St. Martha. Now, the Sisters of St. Martha originated in Antigonish, but when they built this hospital, they needed someone to actually run it and be nurses at the hospital, so they called on the Sisters of St. Martha's from Antigonish to come up and do that. That's the nurses' residence on the right, that building. This is Harborview Hospital in Sydney Mines, and it was the house of Graham Fraser, who was the superintendent of the Sydney Mines Steel Company, and he donated his house and land for a hospital, and there you see it in this picture. This is the Ross Memorial Hospital in Sydney, operated by the Sisters of St. Martha's. The Sisters of St. Martha's did a wonderful thing in eastern Nova Scotia by providing their, so to speak, free service as nurses to various hospitals. This is the St. Mary's Hospital in Inverness, and the building on the right is the TB annex that was necessary to try to separate TB patients from the regular patients. This is a very poor picture, but the only picture I can find of the county asylum at Sydney River. It had 100 patients in 1910, and I expect that if you went in there in 1910, it would be pretty close to Bedlam, because there were people in there that were not only paupers, but people who were mentally insane, and what were known as the harmless insane, who were so far gone that there was no treatment for them at all. We would sort of think today that they had dementia or Alzheimer's, but at that time, of course, Alzheimer's wasn't even known about or never commented on. And this is the Inverness County Asylum at Mabou, opened in 1924. A big building. There were about 125 people in that structure. And when it burned in 1947, they were able to get them all out, except for one person who burned to death. So that's the end of my story about Cape Breton medicine. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, you can contact me through many sources, the university or through the Medical History Society in Nova Scotia. Thank you very much.